Hey beautiful, have you considered subscribing to our channel? It helps us make quality content for you. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
Jake's chest tightened as the acrid smell of smoke hit him, searing his lungs. The air was thick, the orange glow of flames licking at the sky, rising high above the barn like a beacon of destruction. His heart hammered against his ribcage, and his hands trembled at his sides. He had been working on that barn for years, painstakingly crafting every corner, and now it was being devoured by fire. His thoughts scrambled, not sure whether to scream, run, or just stand there and watch, as his livelihood turned to ash. From a distance he could see the shadows of firefighters moving, their figures swallowed by the flames as they rushed to contain the inferno. But it was too late. The barn had been engulfed too quickly, and all he could do was watch helplessly. The crackling fire was deafening, a roar that drowned out everything else, but Jake's mind could hear the faint echoes of his dogs barking, his loyal canines still inside, desperate to escape. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message. It was from his neighbor, Sarah. "I think I saw Margaret near your barn earlier today. She had a gas can." Jake's stomach lurched. Margaret, the Karen of the neighborhood, the self-appointed president of the HOA, and a woman who had made Jake's life hell ever since he moved in. She'd been nitpicking about his property for months, leaving him passive-aggressive notes about his barn, demanding it be demolished, claiming it violated HOA codes. She was relentless, a woman obsessed with rules and control, and today, it seemed she had taken her obsession too far. Margaret had always hated the barn. She called it an eyesore. "It doesn't fit with the neighborhood's aesthetic," she'd say, as if she owned the whole place. No amount of explaining had made a difference. To her, the barn was an offense to the perfection she imagined for the street. But Jake had his reasons. It wasn't just a barn. It was where he'd been training his dogs, working with the local police force and national canine teams to prepare for real-world threats. The barn had served a higher purpose than any of the HOA's petty rules could understand. It was more than just a building. It was Jake's passion, his livelihood. The flames, now roaring through the barn, weren't just a loss of timber and metal. They were a loss of trust, a loss of years of hard work. His throat tightened, grief and rage mixing in a cauldron of seething emotions. He wanted to march over to Margaret's house, confront her, and demand an explanation. But that wouldn't bring back his dogs. It wouldn't fix the damage that was already done. The fire, now a raging inferno, told him that. His eyes blurred with unshed tears, but he blinked them back. No, not now. Not when there was something more important to focus on. He was losing the battle, but the war wasn't over. The fire department might have arrived too late, but Jake's mind was already racing with thoughts of retribution. Margaret had crossed a line today, and he was determined to make her regret it. The distant sound of sirens grew louder as the fire trucks approached. Jake's gaze was fixed on the barn, now just a skeleton of what it had been. His dogs, his partners, were gone. The canines, trained for the most dangerous situations, were lost to this woman's obsession with rules. There was nothing anyone could do now, and as the firefighters began their work, Jake turned away, fists clenched at his sides. He didn't speak, didn't call out. The pain was too raw, the loss too overwhelming. But something inside him stirred, a flicker of cold fury. Margaret had started this fire, and she had no idea what she had just done. As Jake walked slowly to his truck, his thoughts began to crystallize. He had to stop her. It wasn't just about the barn or the dogs. No, this was about justice. Margaret had assumed she could ruin his life without consequences, that her petty, self-righteous reign over the neighborhood gave her the power to destroy anything that didn't meet her ideal. But he wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time. He would find a way to make her pay. The fire raged on in the background, but Jake's resolve was set. This wasn't just a fire, it was the spark of something much bigger, something he hadn't expected, but knew now he couldn't avoid. Margaret had picked the wrong person to mess with. As he climbed into his truck, he glanced at the orange glow one last time, his heart heavy with the loss, but also burning with the promise of retribution. There was no going back now. He was going. to make sure Margaret knew exactly what it meant to mess with the wrong man and the wrong cause. But first he needed to think. He needed a plan. The next day, the quiet hum of suburban life seemed unbearable to Jake. He had spent the morning walking through the smouldering remains of his barn, his shoes crunching over the charred remnants of what used to be his livelihood. Ashes and broken. Timber were scattered across the land, remnants of a passion that had been reduced to nothing in a matter of hours. His heart was still raw with the weight of his loss, but beneath the grief was a spark, one that was growing fiercer with every thought of Margaret. Jake had never been one for confrontation. He was a man who worked with his hands, who valued peace and solitude over the noise of the world. But Margaret was a different beast. She wasn't just a thorn in his side, she was a bulldozer, a relentless force of nature that saw the world through a lens of rules and control, wielding the HOA's bylaws like a sledgehammer. She didn't care about the people she hurt as long as things were proper in her eyes. That had been clear the first time she'd knocked on his door, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowed in judgment. "This barn is an eyesore," she had told him, her tone clipped and imperious. "It doesn't fit the neighborhood standards. You'll need to remove it." She barely spared him a glance as she handed him the violation notice, like she was delivering a simple, inevitable fact. The HOA, in all its glory, had no room for such unsightly structures. It wasn't just a barn, it was an affront to her perfect vision of the world. At first, Jake had tried to reason with her. He had explained that the barn wasn't just a storage building, that it housed the K-9 training operation that had brought national law enforcement teams to his property for years. He had hoped she'd understand, but Margaret wasn't interested in understanding. She only saw the barn as a blight on her pristine neighborhood, a symbol of chaos in her neatly manicured world. "Those dogs aren't even supposed to be here," she had said, her words dripping with disdain. "I don't care what you do for a living. This is a residential area." She didn't care that the dogs were vital, trained for the most dangerous situations, from search and rescue missions to apprehending criminals. It didn't matter to her that the barn was a community asset, a place where police officers and K-9s trained to protect others. It didn't matter because it didn't fit her perfect picture. Margaret's authority in the HOA was practically unchallenged. She had a way of getting what she wanted, twisting the rules and using them as a weapon. For months, Jake had felt the slow burn of her harassment, the threatening letters, the passive-aggressive notes, and the constant insinuation that he wasn't part of her idea of what the neighborhood should be. But now, with the fire smoldering, in the background, all those months of pressure had boiled over. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore, this was war. Jake had tried to ignore it at first, telling himself that Margaret was just an isolated problem in the sea of suburban life. But now, as the smoke from his barn still lingered in the air, he understood the truth. She had taken something from him that was irreplaceable, and she hadn't just stolen his property, she had stolen the trust of the community. And worst of all, she had endangered the safety of everyone with her recklessness. Jake sat at his kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the window, but there was no warmth to it. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the wood, each tap a countdown. His mind raced, going over every detail, every interaction with Margaret, every letter she'd sent, every condescending remark. He wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. The phone rang, pulling Jake from his thoughts. It was Officer Tony, his old friend from the police K-9 unit. "Jake, I heard about the fire," Tony said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "I'm so sorry, man, that barn, those dogs. Hell, I don't even know what to say." "It's gone, Tony, they're gone, everything's gone," Jake muttered, his voice tight with emotion. "And I have a pretty good idea who did it." Tony was silent for a moment before he spoke again, his voice laced with frustration. "I've been hearing rumors that Margaret's been causing trouble with the barn for months now. I can't believe she'd go this far, though. This isn't just about the barn, Jake. She might have just burned it down, but she also destroyed a whole part of the department's training. And those dogs, they were more than just pets." "I know. But that's not all," Jake replied, his grip on the phone tightening. "I can't let this slide. I don't care about the damn HOA rules anymore. I'm going to make her regret this." Tony sighed. "I'll back you up, man. Whatever you need. You know I'm in your corner." The words were a small comfort, but they were enough to spark the fire inside Jake once more. He wasn't going to let Margaret get away with this. She thought she could destroy everything he had worked for, thought she could burn it all down, without consequence. But she hadn't counted on the fact that Jake wasn't alone. And this time, he was going to turn her petty power games back on her. The first step was simple. He needed to expose her. Margaret's public image, her reputation as the HOA queen, was everything to her. She thrived on control, on the idea that she was untouchable. He would make her feel what it was like to be powerless, to be out of control. He just needed to gather the right evidence. But Jake knew that revenge wasn't just about making her suffer. It was about making sure she never did this to anyone else again. He wasn't going to let this end in smoke and ashes. No, he was going to build a new fire, one that would burn through everything Margaret had built until there was nothing left but the truth. And when that truth came out, the whole neighborhood would see her for what she truly was, a bully, a manipulator, and someone who had crossed a line she would never be able to uncross. Jake wasn't going to let it rest. Not now. Not ever. Jake spent the next few days gathering evidence, methodically piecing together the puzzle of Margaret's crimes. The flames had consumed the barn, but they hadn't erased the tracks that led to her. He combed through the charred remains, digging, through the ash, searching for anything that might tie her directly to the fire. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure she faced the consequences of what she'd done. Jake had a plan, and it was slowly taking shape. The first thing he did was check the security footage from the cameras around his property, the ones on his truck, the ones on the house. He knew the fire department had probably seen everything, but they were focused on containment. Jake needed something sharper, something more incriminating. He scrolled through the footage, his fingers pausing over every frame, every second of video. Then he found it. A blur, a figure moving near the barn late at night, holding something in her hands. It was a small moment, maybe a minute or two, but it was enough. The unmistakable silhouette of Margaret, her face partially obscured by a hat, was unmistakable. And in her hands was a gas can. Jake zoomed in on the footage, his blood running cold as the pieces of the puzzle snapped into place. Margaret had done this. She had come to his property, likely under the cover of darkness, and set the fire that had destroyed everything he cared about. It wasn't just a petty act of vandalism. It was a deliberate attempt to wipe out his entire operation. She had crossed the line. She had tried to erase him. Jake leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, a mixture of anger and cold satisfaction swirling in his chest. The truth was undeniable. Margaret was the architect of his pain, the cause of the destruction, and now he had the proof. But what to do with it? He wasn't going to just show up at her door with this footage demanding an apology. No, that wouldn't work. Margaret was too arrogant, too entrenched in her idea of control. She would deny everything, lie her way out, maybe even make him look like the villain in the process. He needed to play this carefully. He needed to expose her, not just to him, but to everyone in the neighborhood, to anyone who had ever looked the other way, while she used the HOA to terrorize the people around her. Jake sat at his kitchen table, the video still playing on his laptop, as his mind worked through the next steps. It wasn't enough to show up at her doorstep. He needed a way to get this footage into the hands of people who would make sure she couldn't escape. Social media. It was a weapon, a tool that could spread the truth faster than anything else. And there was one person who would help him, his friend Maria. Maria was an investigative journalist, someone Jake had known for years. She had a knack for digging into the dirt that others tried to bury. When it came to people like Margaret, people who thought they could manipulate their way through life, Maria was a force of nature. She had a reputation for uncovering the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. Jake knew she could help him make this go viral, spread the footage far and wide, until everyone in the neighborhood and beyond knew exactly who Margaret was. He picked up his phone and dialed her number, the sound of it ringing seeming louder in the silence of his house. "Jake?" Maria's voice crackled through the line, warm and familiar. "What's up?" "I need your help," Jake said, his voice tight. "It's about Margaret. She set fire to my barn. There was a beat of silence on the other end, and then Maria spoke, her tone shifting from casual to concerned. "Wait. What? She did what?" "She set fire to my barn. I have the footage. I need to expose her." Maria's disbelief was palpable, but Jake could hear the wheels turning in her mind. She knew how dangerous Margaret could be, how insidious she was. "With her power. Send me the footage, I'll look it over." Jake didn't hesitate. He sent her the video file, his fingers working quickly as he attached it to the message. "It's all there. You can see her holding the gas can, getting close to the barn. I know it's her." Maria didn't reply right away. Jake could hear the rustling of papers or the tapping of keys as she reviewed the footage. When she spoke again, her voice was sharper, focused. "This is bad, Jake. If she did this, it's not just arson. This is criminal. I can help you get this out there. You need to hit her where it hurts. Make sure she's exposed. People like her, they thrive on control, on the illusion of power. We can shatter that." Jake's lips twitched in a grim smile. This was exactly what he needed. Someone who understood the stakes, who didn't just want to expose the truth, but wanted to bring it crashing down on the people who thought they could get away with anything. "I'm all in," Jake said. "But I need you to handle the details. You know how to do this. How to make sure everyone knows, not just the neighborhood, the whole town." Maria laughed softly. "Don't worry. This is going to be viral by the end of the week." Jake didn't doubt her for a second. Maria had a way of making even the most shocking truths go viral. She had contacts in the media, in local news stations and online forums. She could turn this small suburban drama into something much bigger. Margaret wouldn't just be a figurehead in the HOA anymore. She would be exposed as the petty, dangerous woman she was. Jake ended the call with Maria, his thoughts clearer than they'd been in days. It was time to take this fight to the streets. Margaret had underestimated him. She thought she could burn him down and walk away untouched. But now the fire was hers to deal with, and it was only going to get bigger. The truth was coming for her, and there was nowhere she could hide. Jake stood up, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. But with Maria on his side and the proof in his hands, he was finally going to make Margaret pay. Jake stood in front of his computer, watching the footage for the 100th time. Each frame was seared into his memory. The unmistakable way Margaret moved, the way she held that gas can like a weapon, her smug expression hidden in the shadows. He could feel his pulse quicken, the injustice of it all flooding his senses again. But this time it wasn't just about him or the fire. This was bigger. This was about turning the tables on a woman who had thought she was untouchable. He couldn't wait any longer. The time had come to expose Margaret for the villain she truly was. But Jake wasn't going to do it alone. He needed to make sure that when the truth came out, it wasn't just a story. It was a bombshell. Maria had been working around the clock, reaching out to her network, lining up news outlets and influencers. Her strategy was simple: get the footage in front of the right eyes and let the dominoes fall. Jake's phone buzzed on the table, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Maria. "It's ready. I've posted the video and it's already starting to spread. It's only a matter of time before Margaret knows." A surge of satisfaction coursed through him. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for. He wasn't just going to take down a neighbor who had made his life miserable. He was going to tear down the walls of her carefully curated world. The HOA, the community, the perfect image she'd built around herself, none of it would survive. The truth. Jake stood and paced the room, anticipation building in his chest. The walls of his house felt too small, too suffocating. He needed to get out. He needed to see it unfold. He grabbed his keys, his mind already racing through his next steps. He'd seen this kind of thing before. People with power, people who thought they could act without consequence. They all made the same mistake. They underestimated the people they hurt. He drove through the quiet neighborhood, the morning sun casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. He could almost hear Margaret's voice in his head, demanding that everything fit her version of reality, that nothing should disrupt her perfect little bubble. Her bubble was about to burst. As he pulled up to his house, his phone rang again. It was Maria. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice full of exhilaration. "It's going viral. News outlets are picking it up. People are starting to talk. Margaret's name is everywhere. Jake's stomach tightened with a mixture of triumph and disbelief. Margaret had worked so hard to cultivate her reputation. She had prided herself on being the queen of the HOA, the ruler of the neighborhood. But now, she was the villain. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice low. "I just spoke to a reporter. They got a tip from someone who was at her house earlier. She's in damage control mode, trying to sweep everything under the rug. But it's too late. People know. They're talking." Jake felt a rush of vindication. The moment he'd been waiting for had arrived. He could almost see the panic in Margaret's eyes, her perfect world cracking under the weight of the truth. The next few hours were a blur. Jake watched as social media exploded with the footage, as neighbors began to gather, exchanging gossip, outrage, and disbelief. Margaret's house, once the picture of quiet luxury, became the epicenter of a storm. It wasn't long before her house was surrounded by reporters and onlookers, all wanting a glimpse of the woman who had tried to destroy Jake's life. It didn't take long for the HOA to step in. They had no choice but to suspend her from her position. The very thing Margaret had built her life around was crumbling before her eyes. She tried to maintain her composure, but Jake knew better. Behind that facade of control, she was unraveling. Jake stood in the midst of the chaos, watching. As Margaret was escorted out of her home by police, the look on her face was one of complete disbelief. Shock, anger, fear. She had never thought it would come to this. She had underestimated the damage a single act of retribution could cause. As the police car pulled away, Jake's thoughts were sharp, clear. Margaret had thought she could play with people's lives without consequence. She thought she could take everything from him and get away with it. But now, she was paying the price. Not only had she lost her position in the HOA, but her reputation had been irreparably shattered. The neighborhood she had ruled over with an iron fist would never see her the same way again. Jake walked down his driveway, a slow smile spreading across his face. The battle had been long and painful, but it was finally over. Margaret had been exposed, her cruelty laid bare for all to see. As he reached the sidewalk, he saw a group of neighbors standing in front of their houses, whispering to each other. They glanced at Jake as he walked past, nodding to him in silent recognition. He had done it. He had brought justice to a woman who thought she could destroy him. "Hey, Jake!" a voice called out. It was Sarah, the neighbor who had warned him about Margaret the night of the fire. She was standing with a few others, her arms crossed over her chest. "We're all just sorry, we didn't realize what she was doing, but you—" She looked him up and down, admiration in her eyes. "You did something about it. You fought back. It's impressive." Jake gave a small nod, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. He had won, but not without sacrifice. The barn, the dogs, it still hurt. But now there was something else to focus on. Margaret had been brought to justice, and the neighborhood was free from her oppressive grip. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace. As he stood there watching the sun dip low behind the houses, Jake's thoughts drifted to the future. His barn might be gone, but he could rebuild. He had his dogs, his friends, and a community that had finally seen the truth. The fight was over, but the road ahead was just beginning, and this time he would be ready. Margaret had thought she could destroy him. Instead, she had ignited something much bigger. And as the shadows of the night crept across the street, Jake knew one thing for certain. Her reign was over.